"Please, not again," she whispered, and the sound of those 3 words stopped Caleb Harrow colder than the Montana wind outside his cabin door. Snow had been falling for hours, thick and slanting, packing itself against the porch rail and the fence posts and the dark windows of the barn until the whole ranch looked half-buried and waiting to disappear. Caleb had seen storms like this before. He knew how quiet they could make the world. He knew how fast they could take a life if a person was caught too far from shelter. That was why he had turned his horse off the north trail at dusk when he spotted the broken wagon near the creek crossing. One wheel had split clean through. A mule stood trembling in its traces. And beside the drifted bank, half covered in snow, lay a woman with one hand still closed around a leather cord so tightly her knuckles had gone white from it. He had carried her home without thinking twice, though men in the valley would have said Caleb Harrow was the kind who thought twice about everything. At 39, he lived alone in a house built for more voices than his own, and the silence had shaped him into something spare and careful. He kept cattle, repaired fences, spoke when needed, asked little from the world. But now a stranger sat wrapped in 2 wool blankets on the edge of his narrow bed, rainwater and melted snow darkening the floorboards beneath her boots, her long dark hair damp against her shoulders, her face pale from cold and exhaustion. The fire threw a restless orange light over the room. Wet wool steamed near the stove. Wind pressed at the walls with a long, low sound that almost felt alive. Caleb knelt in front of her with a basin of warm water and clean cloth, trying to ease the frost from her hands without startling her more than the storm already had. "You are safe here," he said, keeping his voice low. "No one is going to hurt you tonight." But safety was not a word she seemed to trust. Even half-conscious, she flinched at the nearness of him. Her breathing stayed thin and uneven. And when he gently pushed back the soaked edge of her sleeve to see whether the scrape along her forearm needed stitching, that was when she whispered it. "Please, not again." Caleb stopped. Not because of fear, because he knew that tone. He knew the sound of a person bracing for old pain before the new one had even arrived. His eyes dropped to her arm. At first he saw only reddened skin, snow burn, the blue trace of cold under the surface. Then the fire shifted, and the light caught something older. A scar. Not jagged like an accident. Not soft like time had made peace with it. This was deliberate. Burned into the skin long ago, faded but still there. Caleb froze, the damp cloth still in his hand. Outside, the wind rattled the shutter once and moved on. Inside, the room seemed to draw in around that one small mark. The woman opened her eyes then, dark and watchful even through fever and fatigue, and for one brief second he saw it plainly. She was not only running from the storm. She had been running long before the first snow fell. And whatever had left that scar on her arm had not finished with her yet. Caleb did not ask her about the scar that night. Men who live long enough in lonely places learn that some truths come only when they are given room, and some are driven deeper if a hand reaches too quickly. So he said nothing. He set the basin aside, fed another split log into the stove, and laid a dry blanket across the foot of the bed in case the first 2 lost their warmth before dawn. The woman watched him through heavy eyes, her grip never loosening on the leather cord wound around her hand. In the shifting firelight, the small silver ring tied to it flashed once, then disappeared again inside her fist. Caleb noticed that too. He noticed most things, though he had trained himself for years to act as if he had not. "You need rest," he said. "The storm is not letting anyone leave tonight." She looked toward the shuttered window as if she could still see through the walls, as if whatever hunted her might arrive out of the white dark at any moment. Her lips parted, but no answer came. Caleb reached for the kettle instead, poured hot water into a cup, and stirred in a spoonful of molasses. "Drink this." She hesitated before taking it, not because she doubted the cup, but because receiving care seemed to cost her more than cold ever had. At last she wrapped both hands around the tin and drew it close. Steam rose across her face. "What is your name?" Caleb asked. For a second he thought she might refuse him. Then, in a voice worn thin by weather and whatever had come before it, she said, "Mara." No last name, no explanation, just one word, placed carefully between them like something breakable. Caleb gave a single nod. Caleb. He did not tell her she was in his cabin 12 miles north of Redemption, or that the nearest neighbor was far enough away that no one would hear her cry out if she needed help. Those facts could wait. They were facts a frightened person might hear as warnings instead of reassurance. He dragged his chair back toward the table, giving her space, then sat with his elbows on his knees and watched the stove breathe heat into the room. Outside, the wind kept working at the house in slow, patient gusts. Snow hissed against the walls. The old clock on the shelf ticked on in the silence, steady as a heartbeat. Mara drank in small swallows. Once, when the cup slipped slightly in her hand, Caleb saw that her wrist was rubbed raw beneath the cuff, as if rope or rough leather had lived there too long. He looked away before she could catch him seeing it. That was how the night settled around them. Not easy, not calm, but held together by the smallest things: warmth, distance, and the choice not to demand what had not yet been freely given. Sometime past midnight, Mara fell into a shallow sleep. Not the deep kind that heals. The kind that lets a body drift while the mind keeps one eye open. Twice she jolted awake with a sharp breath, every muscle drawn tight. Twice Caleb was already there in the lamplight, not touching her, just saying, "You are here. The storm is outside." That is all. The second time, she did not seem to believe him at first. Her eyes searched the room, the ceiling beams, the door, the iron stove, his face. Then slowly, very slowly, the panic went out of her shoulders, though not entirely. Caleb stayed awake after that, boots still on, chair tipped back against the wall. Sleep had never come. Easy to him anyway. Not since the winter fever took the last voices out of his house and left only the scrape of wind under the eaves. He had buried his wife on the hill above the creek. Buried his little girl beside her 3 days later. Since then he had learned to live like a man traveling light through his own life. Work at first light. Supper at dusk. No visitors unless necessary. No promises he could not keep. Yet now there was a stranger sleeping under his roof, and the sight of that old scar on her arm had stirred something he had spent years teaching into silence. By morning the storm had worn itself thin. Pale light pushed through the gaps around the shutter, turning the room from orange to gray. The world outside looked remade. Every fence rail buried to the middle, every tree wearing a cold white edge. Caleb rose, opened the stove, and coaxed the fire back to full life. The cabin filled with the smell of fresh coffee and wood smoke. Mara awoke to that smell and to the sound of him moving about the room with the quiet economy of a man used to being alone. For a few seconds, she seemed not to remember where she was. Then her hand flew at once to the leather cord. Finding it still there, she let out a breath Caleb guessed she had been holding in her sleep. He set a plate on the table. Biscuits warmed in the skillet. Beans left from the night before. A little bacon grease for flavor, not luxury. "Can you stand?" he asked. Mara tried before answering. The moment her boots met the floor, pain crossed her face and one hand shot to the bedpost. Caleb was beside her in 2 steps, then stopped himself before reaching too far. "Ankle." She nodded once. He crouched to look. "Swollen, but not broken. You twisted it near the creek," he said. "You will not be going anywhere today." At that, something changed in her expression. Not weakness. Fear. Clean and immediate. She looked past him toward the door, toward the blank white world beyond it. And Caleb understood before she spoke that staying put frightened her more than the injury did. "I cannot remain here," she said. "You can," Caleb answered. "For today you can." Mara shook her head, already trying to pull herself upright on a bad foot. "You do not understand." Caleb lifted his eyes to hers. The morning light made the lines in his face look older, deeper, more weathered than they had by firelight. "Then help me do that," he said. And for the first time since he had carried her in from the storm, she looked at him not only with fear, but with the thin, dangerous beginning of a choice. Caleb held her gaze and waited. He did not press. He did not tell her to calm down. And he did not make the mistake of calling fear unreasonable just because he could not yet see all of it. Outside, the storm had passed, but winter still sat heavy on the land. The yard beyond the window was a sheet of white cut by the dark rails of the fence and the tracks of his boots from the barn to the porch. The cottonwoods by the creek stood still as bone. Everything looked quiet. Mara looked at that quiet the way a hunted thing looks at open ground. "If I stay in one place too long, they find me," she said at last. Caleb said nothing. A person will keep talking when silence does not judge them. Mara lowered herself carefully back onto the edge of the bed, more because her ankle forced her than because she had chosen to stop moving. Her fingers tightened around the leather cord again. I was not supposed to be on that wagon alone, she said. I got off the main road before dawn and paid a freight driver to take me west, but he turned south when the weather changed. He said he knew a shorter crossing. He said many things. Her voice stayed even, but Caleb heard what sat beneath it. Not anger. Weariness. The kind that comes when promises have been used too often against you. He crossed to the stove, poured coffee into a second tin cup, and set it on the table within reach of her hand, but not into it. Who is looking for you? He asked. Mara looked down at the floorboards. The fire snapped once behind the stove door. In the daylight, she seemed younger than she had in the storm, but not softer. Hard travel and harder memory had a way of carving years where they were not owed. Hey, man with papers, she said. A man who thinks papers make him lawful. Caleb gave a small breath through his nose. In Montana, that could have described half a dozen men, and all of them trouble. Does he have a name? Mara hesitated so long he thought she might refuse him. Then she said, Silas Vane. The name did not strike Caleb like thunder. It landed slower than that, like a fence post driven one hard blow at a time. He knew of Vane. Everyone within 50 miles of Redemption knew of him. A wealthy landholder. A lender. The kind of man who wore polished boots in muddy places and always seemed to arrive after other people had run out of options. Caleb's eyes moved once to the scar on her arm, now covered again by the blanket, then to the ring at her wrist, then back to her face. What does Silas Vane want with you? Mara's jaw tightened. He says my mother owed him. Caleb waited. And did she? She lifted her eyes then, and there was something fierce in them, something that had survived too much to bow easily. She owed winter. She owed hunger. She owed every bad season this land ever gave us. But not him. Caleb believed her before the last word left her mouth. Not because he was foolish. Not because a hard face and sad eyes could prove innocence. He believed her because he had seen men like Vane before. Men who held out help with one hand and took more than they were given with the other. He pulled a chair closer and sat down, elbows on his knees, hat still on the peg by the door, morning light playing across the room. Tell me only what I need to know, he said. Enough to keep trouble from walking in here uninvited. Mara looked at him for a long moment, measuring. Then she opened her hand and let the ring fall into her palm. It was small, worn smooth at the edge, engraved with a mark too old and deliberate to be decorative. This was my mother's, she said. Her mother wore it before her. There is a record in Red Elk Valley. A mission registry. Names. Family line. The place our people were counted before the land changed hands, and men started pretending that counted more than blood. Caleb leaned forward a little. And Vane wants the ring. Not the ring itself. Mara closed her fingers over it again. He wants what it proves. The room went still around that. Caleb had spent years keeping his life small enough to manage. Cattle. Hay. Winter stores. Repair what breaks. Speak little. Expect less. Yet even he could see the shape of what she was saying. If there was a record, then there was a truth older than whatever papers Vane had been waving around. Why not go to the sheriff? He asked. Mara gave him a look so tired it made the answer before she spoke it. Because men like Silas Vane speak to sheriffs before women like me ever reach the door. Caleb could not argue that. He knew the sheriff in Redemption. Decent on good days. Careful on bad ones. Too respectful of polished men and stamped documents. Too ready to call injustice a misunderstanding if it kept the street quiet. Caleb looked toward the window. The storm had left the valley bright and empty, but roads would open by noon. Once the drifts settled, riders could move again. If Vane had men searching, a broken wagon at the creek crossing would not stay hidden long. Mara saw the thought pass over his face. I should leave before they come, she said. She made to stand again. This time Caleb did rise and put one hand out, palm open, not touching her, just stopping the motion with steadiness alone. On that ankle, you will not make 2 miles. Then I will make 1. And after that, she said nothing. Her eyes flashed, not with defiance, but with the anger of someone cornered by reality one time too many. Caleb understood that anger. He had carried it himself after the fever, when every sunrise felt like an insult because the world had not ended with his grief. He lowered his hand. Listen to me, he said quietly. I am riding into Redemption this afternoon for feed and lamp oil. I can ask what Vane is saying without using your name. I can see who is sniffing around. Until then, you stay here. Door barred. Stove fed. No one comes in unless I knock twice. Wait, then once. Mara watched him as if she had not decided whether this was kindness or another kind of trap that simply took longer to show itself. Why would you help me? She asked. Caleb looked at the coffee steaming faintly on the table, then at the house around him, every board of it built for a life that had gone silent years ago. Because winter is hard enough, he said. Then, after a beat, and because I do not much like men who hide behind paper. Mara's face changed at that. Not much, just enough to matter. The fear did not leave it. Fear that old does not leave in a morning. But something else made room beside it. Something smaller and more dangerous than trust. Hope. Outside, a crow crossed the white field and vanished over the fence line. Inside, Caleb stood, reached for his hat, and knew before he opened the door that by sundown the quiet life he had spent years protecting might already be gone. Redemption looked almost gentle from a distance that afternoon, the way many hard places do when seen through winter light. Snow still clung to the shaded sides of the boardwalk and lay in dirty ridges along the street where wagon wheels had broken it apart. Smoke rose from the mercantile chimney. A dog slept under the hitching rail by the blacksmith shop. Men stood in small knots outside the feed store with their hands in their coat pockets, talking in low voices about weather, beef prices, and other matters they could pretend were simple. Caleb rode into town with a sack list in one pocket and a storm of newer thoughts in his head. He tied his horse outside Henderson's store, knocked the snow from his boots, and stepped inside where the smell of coffee beans, lamp oil, and burlap always hung in the air like a second ceiling. Mrs. Henderson looked up from the counter, gave him the same polite nod she had given him for 10 years, and then looked just a second too long, which told him town talk had already gotten ahead of him. Afternoon, Caleb said. Afternoon, Mr. Harrow. Her voice was proper enough, but there was a thin line of curiosity under it. Need flour? Salt? Kerosene? Feed grain? Lamp oil? And coffee if the price has not gone foolish. That won him the smallest smile, and for a minute the room returned to its ordinary shape. Mr. Henderson came out from the storeroom, wiping his hands on an apron, ready to talk hinges and hay, but before Caleb could ask what he needed to ask, the store door opened again, and cold light came in around a man too well dressed for the mud on Redemption Street. Silas Vane did not enter a room so much as arrange himself inside it. His coat was dark wool, fine cut. His gloves looked new. His boots had seen weather, perhaps, but not much honest work. He removed his hat with a measured ease and smiled at Mrs. Henderson as though kindness were his natural language instead of one of his better tools. Mr. Harrow, he said when he saw Caleb. I was told I might find you here. Caleb had met him twice before in passing, once at a cattle sale and once at the sheriff's office when a boundary dispute had brought half the valley to town. Even then he had disliked the way Vane listened. Not with attention, with ownership. Did not know you were looking, Caleb said. Silas rested one hand lightly on the counter, only making inquiries. There was a wagon found half-splintered near the creek crossing after last night's storm. My men say someone might have been traveling in it. Caleb kept his face still. Storm left a good many things broken. So it did. Silas's smile held. And among them, it seems, a trail. Mrs. Henderson busied herself with a ledger she was no longer reading. Mr. Henderson moved a sack of sugar 3 inches, and then stopped moving it at all. Caleb felt the room listening. What sort of trail? He asked. A private matter, Silas said. A woman under lawful obligation to return with me. He said it softly, smoothly, as if any decent man would nod and help without needing details. Caleb thought of Mara's hand locked around the silver ring, the scar on her arm, the way fear had crossed her face at the simple fact of staying still. Lawful is a large word, Caleb said. It grows bigger in some men's mouths than in others. That touched something in Silas's eyes, though his expression never slipped. I deal in contracts, Mr. Harrow. I help families through hard winters. Sometimes gratitude proves shorter-lived than debt. Sometimes debt is what gets called help after the papers are signed. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat softly, the noise of a man who regretted already being in the room. Silas turned his head just enough to show he had heard the challenge and chosen not to answer it directly. You are a practical man, I am told. I admire that. So I will be plain. If a young Apache woman has passed near your ranch, she is not running toward safety. She is running from responsibilities that are not hers alone. Caleb let the silence after that do some work. You always send half the town after women with responsibilities? Silas gave a low, almost friendly laugh. Only when they carry things that are not theirs to keep. There it was. Not a confession. Men like Silas did not offer those. But enough. Enough to make Caleb feel the shape of the trouble clearly now. The ring. The record. The proof older than whatever debt paper Vane had been leaning on. Caleb picked up the tin of lamp oil from the counter and set it back down as if deciding whether he needed it. I have not seen anyone, he said. That was not the whole truth. But it was the kind of answer a man was entitled to give when another man showed up in polished boots asking questions that smelled wrong. Silas studied him for a long second. I hope that remains true, he said. It would be unfortunate for an uninvolved rancher to complicate his life over a matter he does not understand. Caleb met his gaze. Then it is lucky I do not care much for uncomplicated men. For the first time, Silas's smile thinned into something smaller and harder. He placed 2 coins on the counter for a tin of tobacco he did not seem to want, then inclined his head to the Hendersons, as if the room still answered to him. Good day, he said. When the door closed behind him, the whole store seemed to breathe again. Mrs. Henderson looked down at her ledger. Mr. Henderson rubbed the back of his neck. Caleb paid for his supplies, took the sack of feed and the lamp oil, and turned for the door. Careful on the road back, Mr. Henderson said quietly. Caleb stopped with one hand on the latch. Why? Mr. Henderson glanced toward the frosted window. Because men with money do not like being told no, even when no has not been spoken yet. Outside, the day had gone sharper. The sun was lower, the shadows longer, the cold meaner. Caleb tied the feed on behind his saddle and saw the sheriff standing across the street near the office, hat in hand, as if he had been waiting for the right moment and had missed it twice already. Sheriff Bell crossed over with the awkward gait of a man who knew more than he wished to say. Silas asked about you this morning, he said. Caleb adjusted the strap on the feed sack. That's so. Said you keep to yourself. Said that makes you reliable. Caleb gave a dry breath that was not a laugh. He does not know me at all, then. Bell shifted his weight and looked down the road west of town where the snow turned blue in the distance. If a woman came through your land, and if she is the one he is after, I would advise keeping clear of it. Because it is lawful? The sheriff's face tightened. Because it is complicated. Caleb mounted up, settled the reins in his glove, and looked down at him. Complicated is what men call it when a thing is wrong, and they plan to let it continue. Bell did not answer. He stepped back. Caleb turned his horse toward home, but the moment he cleared the edge of town, he knew something had changed. Not in redemption. In himself. He had ridden in telling himself he only meant to listen, ask a few questions, come home with coffee and feed and facts enough to make a sensible decision. But sense had its limits. By the time his ranch came into view under the whitening sky, Caleb understood with a certainty that felt as clean as cold air in his chest that Mara had been right from the start. Men were already following her trail, and if he waited 1 hour too long to choose a side, the choice would be made for him. By the time Caleb rode into the yard, dusk had settled over the ranch in a thin blue hush, and the house looked exactly as he had left it, which told him nothing and everything all at once. Smoke still lifted from the chimney. The mule he had rescued from the broken wagon stood in the side pen with its head low, chewing hay as if no trouble in the world had ever belonged to it. But the snow by the porch had been crossed by more than one set of tracks. Caleb saw that before he even swung down from the saddle. 2 horses had come and gone while he was in town. Their prints were fresh enough to hold an edge. The cold tightened in his chest. He dropped the reins over the hitching post, took the feed sack in one hand and the lamp oil in the other, and climbed the porch steps without hurrying. Men who hurry announce fear. He knocked twice, waited, then once. For half a second there was nothing. Then the bar lifted and the door opened just wide enough for Mara's face to appear in the gap. Her eyes moved over him, his shoulders, the yard behind him, the road beyond, checking the world in one practiced sweep before she opened the door the rest of the way. Caleb stepped inside. Warmth met him first, then the smell of coffee and wood smoke, then the sight of the chair he had left by the stove now turned slightly toward the window, as if she had spent hours listening for hoofbeats. They came, she said before he could speak. Caleb set the feed and oil down near the table. I know. Mara stood with most of her weight on her good foot, the blanket pulled around her shoulders, and the silver ring hidden in her closed hand. Two men. One did the talking. The other watched the windows. Caleb took off his gloves slowly. Silas Vane. She nodded. He did not say his name. He did not have to. Caleb gave a small grim look toward the door. He asked after a woman traveling alone. In town he called it a private matter. Here, I imagine he called it concern. Mara's mouth tightened. He called it obligation. The word hung between them like something sour. Caleb crossed to the stove and fed another piece of wood into the fire. Sparks lifted briefly and died. Sheriff Bell knows he is sniffing around, Caleb said. Whether that means anything useful is another matter. Mara sank into the chair by the table, the effort showing now that the waiting was over. It means we do not have long. Caleb poured coffee into 2 cups and handed one to her. This time she took it without hesitation. That mattered. More than either of them said. Tell me about Red Elk Valley, he said. Mara stared into the steam for a moment before answering. My mother took me there once when I was a little girl. There was a mission near the creek. A priest kept records for families who knew the world was changing and did not trust memory alone to survive it. Names, births, kinship lines. My mother said white men believed a stamp more than a face, and one day that could matter. Caleb sat across from her. Outside, the last light was leaving the sky and the cabin windows were turning black. And your name is there? Mine and hers. Mara looked up. If the record still exists, Silas cannot claim I am what he says I am. He cannot turn me into a debt with a pulse. Caleb let out a slow breath. He thought of Vane in the mercantile, polite as a Sunday suit and twice as false. He thought of the sheriff calling it complicated. He thought of the tracks on his porch. Then we go get it, he said. Mara blinked once, as if she had expected caution, or delay, or a speech about risks. You would take me there? I would rather do that than wait here for Silas Vane to decide my front step belongs to him. Mara looked down at the cup in her hands. Firelight moved softly across her face, and for the first time since he had found her in the storm, Caleb saw something in her expression that was not only fear or endurance. It was disbelief edged with fragile relief, the kind that comes when help arrives without asking to be admired for it. It is 30 miles, maybe more, depending on the road, she said. My ankle will slow you down. Then I will ride slower. He may have men watching the main trail. Then we will not take the main trail. Mara almost smiled at that, though the sadness in her eyes never quite loosened enough to let it happen fully. You always answer trouble like it is weather. Caleb glanced toward the stove. Weather has taught me most of what I know. Silence settled, but not the sharp kind. A workable silence. The kind that can hold decisions without breaking under them. Caleb pulled a folded map scrap from the shelf drawer and spread it on the table beside the lamp. It was not a proper survey map, only a rough hand-drawn guide of creek bends, cottonwood stands, ridge lines, and the old line shack west of Cedar Cut. He traced one route with a blunt finger. If we leave before first light, cut north of the frozen wash, then angle west through the Cedar Ridge, we can stay off the road until almost noon. There is a line shack here. We stop there if the ankle gives out or the weather turns. From there it is another 10 or 12 miles to Red Elk. Mara leaned forward despite herself, the blanket slipping slightly from one shoulder. You know this country well. Well enough to get lost in it less often than other men. Why? She asked softly. Caleb looked at the map, but what he saw for a moment was not Cedar Ridge or creek beds. It was a smaller hand once dragging a wooden horse across his cabin floor. A woman laughing over burnt biscuits. A house that had not always been so quiet. Because after my family died, he said, the land made more sense to me than people did. He had not meant to say that much. The words surprised even him. Mara did not answer right away. When she did, her voice had gone quieter. I am sorry. Caleb gave one slight shake of his head. No use spending sorrow where it has already been spent. But the room had changed after that. Not by much. Just enough for both of them to feel it. Mara reached into the pocket of the borrowed blanket and drew out the ring on its leather cord. In the lamplight, the silver looked old and stubborn, like something that had outlived the hands meant to keep it. My mother used to tell me that names are a kind of shelter, she said. That is why men who want to own you try to take your name first. Caleb looked at the ring, then at her. Then tomorrow we get yours written where no man can pretend not to see it. Outside, the wind moved low across the yard, brushing the barn wall and the porch post like a warning from far off. Inside, they planned in the small circle of lamplight until the coffee turned cold and the fire burned down. To red coals, they packed quietly. Biscuit cloth, dried meat, bedroll, extra blanket, canteen, coffee tin, bandages for her ankle. Caleb set his old revolver belt near the door out of habit more than intention, then left it there without comment. This was not a journey he wanted to find by weapons. It was a journey for proof. For paper. For one woman's right to stand inside her own name. When at last Mara rose to rest, her ankle trembling slightly under her, Caleb stood too. He did not touch her. He only moved the chair aside and said, "We ride before sunrise." Mara paused by the bed and looked back at him across the dim room. "Why are you really doing this?" Caleb rested one hand on the table, rough wood beneath rougher skin. He could have said because it was right. He could have said because Vane made his stomach turn. Both were true, but neither was the whole truth. "Because you asked me to understand," he said. "And now I do." Mara held his gaze for a long second, then gave the smallest nod and lay down with the ring still curled in her hand. Caleb banked the fire, set the lamp low, and took his chair against the wall again. Outside, the valley lay still beneath fresh snow. Inside, the quiet no longer felt like something empty. It felt like the breath a man takes just before stepping into a life he did not know he had already chosen. They left before sunrise, when the world was still more shadow than shape and the cold had a clean, biting edge that made every breath feel newly made. Caleb saddled his bay gelding by lantern light, his movements spare and practiced, while Mara stood near the porch rail wrapped in his heavy coat, the collar turned up against the wind and the silver ring hidden beneath one gloved hand. The ranch behind them looked half asleep under the snow, the barn roof pale, the fence rails buried to the middle, the chimney sending one thin line of smoke into the dark. Caleb tied the bedroll behind his saddle, checked the canteen, then looked once at Mara's ankle as she stepped carefully into the stirrup. "Can you manage?" he asked. Mara gave him the kind of look people wear when pain and pride have made a long acquaintance. "I can ride." Caleb nodded, as if that were enough. He did not offer pity. He only adjusted the stirrup leather a notch lower, so she would not have to bend the joint too sharply, then mounted and turned his horse toward the north cut instead of the road. They rode out with no more sound than leather shifting, hooves breaking crusted snow, and the small breath of morning wind moving through the cottonwoods by the creek. The sky began to pale by inches. First gray, then iron, then a thin wash of silver over the eastern ridge. Montana opened around them in long cold folds of pasture, frozen wash, cedar breaks, and distant hills that looked close enough to touch until a man tried to reach them. Caleb kept them off the main trail just as he had promised, guiding the horses through shallow draws and along the lee side of low ridges where tracks would be harder to read. Mara rode beside him in silence, one hand steady on the reins, the other resting lightly against her coat where the ring and folded cloth bundle sat hidden. For the first hour neither of them said much. The land did the talking. Frosted grass brushing the horses' legs, a raven cutting across the pale sky, the soft crackle of ice where a narrow stream still moved beneath a skim of winter. But silence on a journey is different from silence in a house. It does not press. It travels. By mid-morning the sun had found enough strength to turn the snow bright without making it any warmer. Caleb reined in beneath a stand of cedar near a rocky rise and swung down to let the horses breathe. Mara started to dismount too, then caught herself when the ankle reminded her of its place in the day. Caleb was there in 2 steps, one hand near her elbow without taking hold until she chose to lean into the help. That was how he did things. He offered steadiness, never ownership. Once her boots touched the ground, she stood with a small breath and looked west toward the line of hills beyond which Red Elk Valley waited unseen. Caleb handed her a canteen. "Another 10 miles to the line shack," he said. "We rest there if the weather turns or the ankle gets worse." Mara drank, then passed the canteen back. "You plan as if trouble is livestock," she said. Caleb capped the canteen and gave her the faintest hint of a smile. "Trouble is more predictable than people." They shared a biscuit and a strip of dried beef in the shelter of the cedar while the horses nosed at scrub grass along the rocks. The food was plain, but the act of eating it together changed the day in some quiet way Mara did not miss. Out on the road, Most men took hunger as permission to speak more than they should. Caleb seemed to understand that a meal could also be a form of peace. When they set off again, the trail narrowed into a cut between sandstone bluffs where old snow lingered in shaded pockets and hoofbeats sounded softer than they should have. Near noon, Caleb slowed and leaned slightly in the saddle, studying the ground ahead. Mara saw it at the same time. Another set of tracks, older than theirs but not old enough to be forgotten by the cold. 2 horses, maybe 3, had passed west sometime after dawn. She felt her stomach tighten. Caleb said nothing at first. He only watched the prints where the trail bent around a fallen juniper and disappeared into harder ground. Could be anyone, Mara said, and heard in her own voice how little comfort she found in that. Caleb kept his gaze forward. Could be, but we assume less and notice more. He turned his horse off the cut and led them across rougher ground where broken stone would swallow the sign of their passing. It made the ride slower. It also made it safer. Mara understood then something she had only begun to see since the storm. Caleb Harrow was not fearless. Fearless men often died stupid. He was careful in the way winter teaches a man to be careful when no one is coming to save him if he guesses wrong. That kind of care had kept him alive. Now, for reasons he still had not fully spoken, he was spending it on her. By the time the line shack came into view, the day had grown colder again. It sat low against a wind-bent rise, little more than 4 walls, a warped roof, and a narrow porch half buried in drifted snow. Caleb checked the door, found it stuck but sound, and pushed it open with one shoulder. Inside smelled of old dust, pine pitch, and the long stale quiet of places used only when weather or distance leaves a man no better choice. Still, it was dry. There was a rusted stove in one corner, a shelf, and enough floor space for 2 bedrolls if neither person expected comfort. Mara stepped in behind him and glanced around with the quick, assessing look of someone who had learned to read a room before trusting it. Caleb set down the gear, knelt by the stove, and coaxed a flame from cedar kindling and one precious match cupped carefully in his hand. Soon a small heat began gathering in the shack, enough to push back the bite of the day. Mara sat on the edge of the bench by the wall and unwrapped her ankle while Caleb heated water in a tin pot. Outside, wind moved dry snow across the porch in long soft brushes. Inside, the fire painted warm color over rough boards and tired faces. Caleb carried the water over, crouched in front of her, and looked up once before reaching for the bandage. "Tell me if I am too rough." Mara studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. He cleaned and wrapped the ankle with the same patient steadiness he had shown the first night, not avoiding the injury, not making a spectacle of it. When he finished, Mara looked down at his hands, rough from reins and wire and winter work, now tying a knot careful enough not to pull. "Most men hurry when something is hurt," she said quietly. Caleb sat back on his heels. Most men are in a hurry to stop looking at it. For a second the little shack seemed to hold its breath around them. Mara's gaze lifted to his face. In the low firelight his weathered features had softened, not into ease, but into something more open than before. "You do not look away much," she said. Caleb stood and carried the empty pot back to the stove. "I used to." He said nothing more, and Mara did not ask him to. Some truths, she was learning, lived close enough to the surface in him that kindness meant not reaching too quickly. Evening gathered early over the hills. Caleb poured coffee into 2 cups and handed one to her. They sat with the fire between them and the day behind them, the mission still miles away, the tracks behind them still unanswered, the future no less uncertain than it had been at dawn. And yet something had changed. Not the danger, not the road, something quieter than that. Mara held the hot cup in both hands and listened to the wind move around the shack. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel like the whole world was closing in. It was not safety yet, but it was near enough to make her afraid of losing it. The sound reached them just after dark, not loud, not urgent, just the faint scrape of a horse shifting its weight beyond the shack wall where no horse of theirs should have been. Caleb set his cup down without a word. The fire burned low between them, throwing a thin orange light across the boards, and in that light Mara saw every line in his face sharpen, not with panic, but with the kind of attention men carry only when they have survived by noticing one small thing before it became a large one. He stood, crossed to the door, and listened. Wind brushed snow against the porch step. Somewhere farther out, another horse breathed through its nose. Then a voice came through the wood, old and steady and unafraid. If I meant to hide, rancher, you would not have heard me. Caleb looked back once at Mara. She had already risen from the bench, one hand against the wall for balance, the other closed over the ring beneath her coat. He lifted the latch and opened the door a careful distance. A man stood outside wrapped in a dark blanket coat, his gray-streaked braid hanging over one shoulder, his face lined by weather and years but not bowed by either. His horse waited a few yards back with its head low against the cold. The man did not step forward until Caleb moved aside. Even then he entered the lined shack with the calm of someone who knew exactly how much room his dignity required. His eyes found Mara at once. The change in her face was small but unmistakable. Fear did not leave it, but something older than fear rose to meet this man, something like memory. He spoke first in Apache, one quiet phrase that made Mara's shoulders loosen as if a knot in them had finally heard its true name. She answered in the same language, low and careful, and for a moment Caleb was the only stranger in the room. The man inclined his head, then looked toward Caleb with direct, measuring eyes. My name is Thomas Greyhawk, he said. I knew her mother. Caleb nodded once. Then you are welcome by the fire. Greyhawk accepted the offer without ceremony. He sat on the bench near the stove, held the coffee cup Caleb handed him in both hands, and let the heat settle into his fingers before he spoke again. We have searched for her a long time, he said. Not openly. Open trails belong to men with money. Mara had not taken her eyes off him. Who sent you? She asked. No one sent me, Greyhawk said. I came because the mission keeper at Red Elk told me a man had been asking old questions again. And because word reached us that Silas Vane was offering money for news of a woman carrying a silver ring on a leather cord. At that, Mara drew the ring from beneath her coat and held it in her palm. Firelight touched the old silver and turned it almost white. Greyhawk saw it and gave one slow nod, as if the sight confirmed a promise made years earlier. Your mother was right to keep it hidden, he said. She was right about the records, too. Caleb leaned one shoulder against the wall, listening. You have seen them? Greyhawk turned his gaze toward him. This autumn, the mission registry still stands. Her mother's name is there. Her own name beneath it. Family line. Witness mark. Enough truth to trouble any man who has built his comfort on a lie. Mara lowered herself back onto the bench as if her legs had gone suddenly less certain. Hope did that sometimes. It weakened a body more than fear because it asked the heart to risk something again. Then it still exists, she said. Greyhawk nodded. It still exists. But you must reach it before Silas Vane reaches the men who guard it with his money. The line shack seemed to grow smaller around those words. Outside, the wind moved over the roof in a long, low pass. Caleb looked from Greyhawk to Mara and then to the folded cloth bundle where she kept the ring and what little else she owned. How close is Vane? He asked. Greyhawk drank once from the cup, then set it down. Closer than he should be. He came through the South Road yesterday with 2 men and a sheriff's paper that said nothing useful and suggested much. He thinks paper makes people forget what their eyes know. Caleb gave a quiet breath that was almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. That seems to be his favorite method. Greyhawk studied him. And yet you brought her this far. Caleb met the old man's gaze without flinching. She asked me to understand. I found I preferred that to pretending not to. Something in Greyhawk's face eased at that, not into warmth exactly, but into respect cautious enough to survive this country. He reached inside his coat and drew out a folded scrap of paper wrapped in oilcloth. When he handed it to Mara, her fingers trembled before they steadied. She opened it carefully. Inside was a worn fragment of a mission page with part of her mother's name, the edge of a seal, and a witness notation faded by time. Not enough to win anything by itself. Enough to prove that what she had remembered was real. Mara stared at the paper as if it were the first warm thing she had held in years. Caleb watched her face change, not quickly, not cleanly, but in slow degrees, from guarded endurance into something more dangerous and more human. Grief joined to relief. Loss joined to proof. The right to stop doubting her own memory. My mother gave this to you? She asked. Greyhawk nodded. She said if the valley ever turned against her words, paper might speak where people would not listen. For a long moment no one said anything. The fire shifted. Coffee steamed. Wind pressed lightly at the wall. Then Mara looked up, first at Grey Hawk, then at Caleb. If Silas reaches the mission before we do, he will bury it. He may try, Grey Hawk said. But the priest there is an old man with a stubborn spine. He has not forgotten who came first to that valley and who wrote names down when no one else thought they mattered. Caleb pushed off from the wall and crossed to the rough map. They had left spread on the table. He laid one hand beside the line marking Red Elk Creek. We leave before dawn, he said. No delays. No main road. If Vane is south, we cut west through the upper draw and come down on the mission from the north side. Grey Hawk gave a short nod. I will ride ahead at first light and wait near the cottonwoods above the crossing. 3 riders on one trail make too much noise in men's heads. 2 is easier to ignore. Mara folded the paper again and tied it back in the cloth with the ring, her hands steadier now than they had been all day. You trust him? Caleb asked Grey Hawk. The elder looked at Mara before answering. I trust what I see. She is still wearing her own will. That tells me enough for tonight. He rose then, slow with age but not weakness, and pulled his blanket coat close again. At the door he paused and looked once more at Mara. Your mother was never afraid of men like Silas Vane, he said. She feared what silence would let them become. Do not help them by going quiet now. When he stepped back into the dark, the cold came in around him for a second, and then the door shut. Caleb dropped the bar into place and stood there a moment with his hand still on the wood. Behind him, Mara sat by the fire with the ring and the paper together in her lap, silver and ink, memory and proof. 2 small things. Enough, perhaps, to change the shape of a life. At last Caleb turned. You are closer now, he said. Mara looked up at him through the low firelight, and there was something in her expression he had not seen there before. Not safety. Not yet. But the first honest outline of it. So are you, she said softly. Caleb did not answer right away. He only moved back to the table, sat across from her in the little circle of warmth, and understood with a clarity that felt almost harsh in its simplicity that somewhere between the storm at the creek and this cramped-lined shack, the trouble had stopped being only hers. They reached Red Elk Valley just after noon beneath a pale winter sky that gave the whole world the look of something. Washed clean and not yet trusted. The mission stood on a low rise above the creek, plain white walls weathered by years of wind, a small bell tower, a porch worn smooth by boots, prayer, and waiting. Cottonwoods lined the frozen water below, their branches black against the snow. Caleb saw at once why Mara's mother had chosen this place. It was humble enough to be overlooked and old enough to remember what newer towns preferred to forget. Grey Hawk met them near the upper crossing as promised, his horse standing still beneath him, his expression unreadable except for the fact that he had remained. That alone told Caleb the road ahead had not closed yet. They rode together the last half-mile without speaking. Mara sat straighter in the saddle the nearer they came, though the strain showed in the set of her mouth. Caleb noticed that too. He noticed the way her fingers kept returning to the ring beneath her coat, the way fear and hope can live side by side in a person and make every mile feel twice as long. The priest who opened the mission door was a narrow man with white hair and red hands, the sort of face winter makes honest. He knew Grey Hawk. He looked at Mara for one quiet second, then stepped aside as if he had expected this meeting long before it arrived. Inside, the mission office smelled of old paper, cedar, and lamp oil. Shelves climbed the walls in uneven lines, heavy with ledgers, tied bundles, and records worn thin by years of handling. Lives reduced to ink. Births, marriages, burials, kinship lines, all the small stubborn marks people leave behind because memory alone is too easily stolen. Caleb removed his hat and stayed near the door while Mara came forward with the ring and the folded scrap Grey Hawk had brought the night before. The priest took both with care, studied them under the window light, then turned without a word and reached for a ledger so old its spine had been repaired twice. The room grew quieter as he laid it open. Mara did not sit. Caleb doubted she could have if she tried. Her whole body seemed to be leaning toward that desk, toward the page, toward the possibility that one old line of writing might weigh more than all the lies spoken after it. The priest turned one page, then another. His finger moved slowly down a column. Stopped. Moved back up. Caleb watched Mara's face as the priest looked up over the rim of his spectacles and said, very softly, "Here." That one word carried more force than a shout. Mara stepped closer. Caleb saw the moment she read it. Her mother's name first, then her own beneath it. A witness line. A notation of family origin. A date older than any paper Silas Vane could have arranged after the fact. She did not cry. Some griefs and some mercies sit too deep for tears to reach at first. But her hand pressed flat against the desk as if the room had shifted under her boots, and only that old page was solid. Grey Hawk bowed his head once, not in surprise, but in recognition of a truth finally brought into daylight. The priest turned the ledger slightly, so all of them could see. The record stands, he said. Entered properly. Witnessed. Unchanged. Caleb let out a breath he had not known he was holding. For one brief second, it seemed the hardest part of the road might truly be over. Then the outer door opened. No slam. No raised voice. Only the sound of polished boots on worn floorboards and a current of colder air moving through the room. Silas Vane entered with Sheriff Bell beside him and one hired man hanging back near the doorway like a shadow waiting to see which way the light would fall. Silas removed his gloves with patient fingers, his coat neat, his expression composed, as though he had come to settle a minor business matter rather than stand before a truth he had spent years trying to bend. His eyes went first to Mara, then to the ledger, then to Caleb. I see I arrived just in time, he said. The priest closed one hand over the open page without shutting it. Grey Hawk did not move. Caleb stepped half a pace nearer to Mara, not enough to crowd her, only enough to make it plain she was not standing alone. Sheriff Bell looked as uncomfortable as a man can look while still pretending he is only there to keep order. Silas offered the room a small smile that never touched his eyes. This woman has obligations tied to her family name, he said. I am here to ensure those obligations are not avoided by sentiment or confusion. Mara turned toward him slowly, the ring now visible in her hand. The fear was still in her face. Caleb could see it, but something stronger stood beside it now. Proof had done that. Proof does not erase fear. It changes the ground beneath it. You used my family name only when it suited you, she said. Silas's gaze sharpened. Be careful, he said softly. Facts are not changed by wounded feelings. Caleb heard the priest draw in a quiet breath through his nose. Grey Hawk's eyes narrowed, though his face remained still. Sheriff Bell shifted his weight once, looking anywhere but at Mara. Caleb spoke before silence could help the wrong man. Facts are exactly what brought us here. Silas turned to him. You are out of your depth, Harrow. Caleb met his gaze. That would matter more if I respected the water. For the first time, something like irritation crossed Silas's face. It passed quickly, but not before the room saw it. He rested one hand lightly on the edge of the desk. A mission entry records a birth. It does not settle every financial matter connected to a household. The priest answered before Mara could. No, but it does establish identity, lineage, and the right of a woman to stand before the law as herself, not as a claim invented by convenience. Bell looked up at that. Really looked up. The line of his mouth changed. Mara took one step forward, limping only slightly now, and laid the silver ring beside the open ledger. My mother kept this because she knew men like you would come with papers after the truth was old enough to be doubted, she said. Then she placed Grey Hawk's folded scrap beside it. The small desk now held silver, ink, witness, and record. Humble things. Enough to trouble a polished lie. This is what you were afraid of, Mara said. Not me. Not where I ran. Only that my name could still be found. Silas looked at the ring, then at the page, then at the sheriff. For a man who had spent years making rooms bend toward him, he suddenly seemed to understand that this one was no longer willing. Bell stepped closer to the desk and read the entry again. Once, then twice. When he straightened, the hesitation in him had not vanished, but it had shifted direction. He was no longer uncertain whether the truth existed. He was uncertain how long he had helped men ignore it. If the mission record stands, he said carefully, then no private claim can force this woman's return against her will. No one moved after that. The hired man near the door stared at the floorboards. The priest kept one hand on the ledger. Grey Hawk stood like weathered stone. Mara did not lower her eyes. Caleb watched Silas Vane here, perhaps for the first time in many years, a room stop agreeing with him. There are men who lose loudly. Silas did not. His face remained composed, his posture exact, but the ease had gone out of him all the same. It was there in the way he withdrew his hand from the desk, in the way his next silence lasted too long. Caleb understood then that some reckonings arrive without thunder. No fists, no gun smoke, just a table, a witness, and a woman finally made visible in the name she had carried all along. And when Mara stood there with the ring, the record, and her chin held steady, Caleb realized the shock he had felt the night he saw that scar had not been about what had been done to her. It was about the fact that after all of it, she still had the strength to walk into the light and claim herself. Silas Vane did not argue once the sheriff spoke. That was the sort of thing smaller men did when they were losing in public. He only looked at the open ledger, then at Mara, then at Caleb, and for one brief moment the room saw him plainly, not as the polished lender who moved through towns with papers in one hand and courtesy in the other, but as a man who had mistaken other people's silence for permanent consent. He put his gloves back on one finger at a time and gave a slight nod that tried to pass for dignity. "Then I have been misinformed," he said. No one answered. Not the priest. Not Grey Hawk. Not Sheriff Bell. Even the hired man near the door kept his eyes on the floor, as if he had suddenly discovered no wage was large enough to stand too close to a lie once. It had begun to smell like one. Silas let the silence sit on him for a moment longer, then turned and walked out of the mission office with the careful, measured pace of a man determined to leave, as if he had chosen the hour and shape of his own humiliation. Sheriff Bell watched him go, his face drawn tight with the late understanding of how often he had mistaken quiet injustice for proper order. When the outer door closed, the room remained still for a long breath. Then the priest rested both hands on the ledger and looked at Mara with something gentler than pity and steadier than sympathy. "Your name stands," he said. "No man can take that from the page now without showing his hand to every eye in the valley." Mara lowered herself into the chair beside the desk as though her body had finally received permission to feel the last 3 days. The ring lay near her hand. The scrap Grey Hawk had carried sat beside it. Ink and silver. Small things. Enough. Caleb had seen cattle bought, land lost, and lives changed by less. Grey Hawk stepped forward then and placed one weathered hand lightly against the back of Mara's chair, not holding her up, only standing near enough for her to know she was no longer alone in the shape of her own history. Sheriff Bell cleared his throat and took off his hat. "I will write a statement," he said. "One that makes it plain there is no lawful claim over her person, labor, or movement." He said it stiffly, like a man not used to making himself useful at the right time, but the words mattered more than the grace behind them. The priest brought paper. Bell wrote slowly, his pen scratching across the sheet, while winter light leaned through the window and shifted inch by inch along the floorboards. Mara watched the ink form, and Caleb watched her watching it. He thought of the night at his cabin, when she had flinched from warmth as if kindness itself might come with a hook hidden in it. He thought of the creek crossing, the broken wagon, the old scar on her arm. He thought of how little the world had given her without trying to take more in return. And now here she sat in plain daylight with witnesses, record, and law finally turned in the same direction for once. When Bell finished, he sanded the page, blew the excess aside, and handed the statement to Mara with both hands. She accepted it the same way, not like a prize, like a reclaimed thing. Grey Hawk asked for a copy of the mission entry, and the priest agreed at once. More paper, more ink, more proof for a world too fond of pretending not to remember unless something was written where it could be counted. By the time they stepped outside, the afternoon had begun slipping toward evening. The valley below the mission lay silver and pale under the winter sun, quiet as if nothing of consequence had happened there at all. But news in a frontier town moved faster than weather over open ground, and when Caleb and Mara rode back into Redemption the next day, the change was already waiting for them. No one announced it. No bell rang. No brave speech was given from a porch. It lived in smaller things than that. In the way Mrs. Henderson came out from the mercantile and looked directly at Mara instead of past her. In the way 2 men by the hitching rail lowered their voices when she rode by, not out of contempt this time, but because something in them had remembered shame. In the way Sheriff Bell stepped out of his office holding a copy of the statement and pinned it to the post where notices were nailed, so every man buying feed or tobacco would have to read what he had failed to see before. Silas Vane was nowhere on the street. Caleb was not surprised. Men like Vane rarely stayed in places where the truth had just been given witnesses. Yet the strongest thing in redemption that afternoon was not his absence. It was Mara's presence. She rode straight back beside Caleb, the silver ring hidden no longer, the paper secure inside her coat, and for the first time since he had found her, she did not seem to be bracing for the ground beneath her to shift. She looked tired. She looked marked by all that had come before. But she also looked like someone standing inside her own life, instead of just trying to outrun its ruins. Mr. Henderson lifted a hand from the store porch as they passed. It was an awkward gesture, late, and too small, but Caleb had lived long enough to know that in places like redemption, late decency still counted for something. Mara gave the faintest nod in return and kept riding. They stayed in town only long enough for feed, fresh bandages, and a new lantern wick. Then the road turned home beneath them, and the farther they got from the boardwalk, the easier the air seemed to move. Snow still lay in the fence shadows and under the cottonwoods by the creek, but the sky had cleared into that pale western blue that makes cold country look almost kind. Caleb rode with his hat low and the reins loose, the familiar rhythm of hoofbeats settling into him like something remembered rather than merely heard. For a long while neither of them spoke. They did not need to. The mountain stood where they had always stood. The ranch would be waiting with its porch, its smoke-dark stove, its split rails, its chores that never cared what a man's heart had been through. Yet when the house finally came into view on the rise, it no longer looked to Caleb like a place built mostly for silence. Mara saw it too. "It looks different," she said softly. Caleb glanced at her. "How?" She considered the question as the horses climbed the last slope. "Less like a place a person hides from life. More like a place life might return to." Caleb did not answer right away because the truth of it took him off guard. The yard was just as it had always been, the barn leaning a little west. The stack of split wood by the porch. The water pump, the mule in the side pen, the tracks of daily work crossing and recrossing the same hard ground. Nothing had changed. Everything had. He dismounted first, tied off the horses, then turned back toward her. For a second, he almost offered his hand out of habit and stopped himself, suddenly unwilling to make even help look like something presumed. Mara saw that too. She smiled then, very slightly, and placed her hand in his of her own choice before stepping down. Her fingers were cold inside the glove. Her grip was steady. That mattered. Inside the cabin, the evening gathered around them in the old familiar way, but not with the old emptiness. Caleb set water on for coffee, while Mara unfolded the sheriff's statement and laid it carefully beside the lamp. Not hidden away, not tucked under cloth or coat, but placed in plain sight where both of them could see it. Then she took the ring from its cord and held it up to the light for a moment before slipping it back through the leather loop and tying it once more around her wrist. Caleb watched her do it and understood that some objects stop being reminders of fear the moment they become part of a future again. He handed her a cup. She took it. Their hands brushed, and this time neither of them pulled away too fast. Outside, wind moved softly along the wall and through the cottonwoods beyond the creek. Inside, the lamp cast a warm circle over the table, the paper, the ring, and the quiet between them. Mara looked around the room, at the stove, the shelf, the chair by the wall where he had kept watch that first night, the bed where she had slept with one eye open, the plain rough boards that had held more mercy than many finer places. "I can leave in the morning," she said after a while, though the words sounded less like intention than fairness. Caleb rested one forearm on the table and looked at the cup in his hand before lifting his eyes to hers. "Do you want to?" Mara thought about that for a long moment. There was no fear in the room now, only the weight of an honest choice. "No," she said. It was a simple word. It carried more than most long speeches ever do. Caleb let out a breath that felt as though it had been waiting inside him for years. Not because he had expected her to stay, not because he had earned it, but because somewhere between the storm and the mission and the road home, he had begun hoping in a way he had sworn off long ago. He nodded once. "Then stay." Mara looked at him across the lamp glow, the lines in his weathered face, the steadiness that had never once tried to own what it offered. "Not because I owe you," she said quietly. "I know. Not because I have nowhere else. I know that too." Her eyes softened, not into weakness, but into the kind of peace hard-won people recognize. "On sight. I want to stay where I was seen clearly and not reduced." Caleb had no clever answer for that. Men like him were not built for cleverness. So he told the truth the only way he knew how. There is room here. And there was. In the cabin. In the life he had kept pared down to weather and work and memory. In the silence itself, which no longer sounded like punishment. Later, after the horses were fed and the coffee drunk and the lamp turned low, they stood for a moment on the porch beneath a sky strewn with cold stars. The valley lay wide and still before them, the snow carrying a faint sheen, the cottonwoods moving gently in the dark. Mara pulled the coat closer around her shoulders. Caleb stood beside her without crowding the space. No grand promise passed between them. No easy vow. Out in that part of Montana, people knew better than to speak too largely against the weather. But when the wind came down from the hills, it did not sound lonely anymore. It sounded like the first page of something neither of them had dared expect to live long enough to read.